Performance improvement plans aren't a good thing. If you receive one from your employer, it kind of means you're on life support. They're generally a precursor to termination, typically. So, in the main, the performance improvement plan, or PIP, has little to do, almost never, with improving your performance. There's nothing to do with performance or the improvement of it, because the company is using it as a management tool, their paper trail, to support a separation, typically 30, 60, 90 days, as it says in the PIPs usually, that if you don't, shape up, you're going to have to ship out involuntarily. And it says up to including termination if you don't do what we're asking you to do. But typically, you can't do what they're asking you to do. And if you're a woman in your 40s, 50s, and 60s, it's particularly damaging, which I'll get to in a moment. That unique cohort of clients that I typically represent, and what you should do if you're in that particular, if that's you, except this does really apply to everyone. The notion of a performance improvement plan that management always says, hey, listen, in effect, we love you. These are the things you have to do to start cutting the mustard the way that we want you to do. But again, it's the design is meant to demoralize, and typically for most people that don't have, assembly line jobs where they say to you, if you're a factory worker and they say, listen, you need to produce, as you signed off on this 50 widgets a month. Have you been doing it? No. You've one month you had 38 widgets, and the other times 42, 43, you never hit your mark, and everybody else does. So if you don't have a good excuse that's protected by, something that's a legal protection, like a disability, or you were out on maternity leave, or whatever they're saying that means that you are failing in performance metrics. As a factory worker, you might say, yes, I'm going to start producing 55 widgets a month. And when you do, the company would have little to say, but great. Now we're cooking with Crisco. Let's go do this. Let's keep it up. Keep up the good work. But for most folks in, more sophisticated positions, the PIPs are highly, like your evaluations can be, highly subjective. And often it's simple to create, the hyperbole and the exaggeration and the falsehoods and the misrepresentations. Or they just tell you, you need, not only are we demoralizing you now and saying to you, you know what, sister, this ain't working out. And we're letting you know, we don't think much of your performance, your attitude, your deliverables, any of it. So now we're telling you, you got 60 days to turn this ship around. And this is what we expect of you. And typically what they're saying they expect of you can't be done anyway, let alone under the gun, let alone when you're now utterly distressed by the fact that you're on probation effectively, right? So when you can't do it, or you just become too depressed and anxious over the fact that your employer, you may have given them 15 years of your life with an unblemished record, and suddenly, seemingly out of the blue, for whatever other reason, if it's not actually you saying, yeah, you know what, it's my bad, I'm sorry, I'll pick up the pace, I haven't been paying attention, it's on me. What are the chances? So and typically that's not what it's about. If it is what it's about, take your lumps, do what you have to do, and deal with it. But in my experience, especially representing women for the last 25 years in all manner of sex-based discriminatory claims, and there are lots of them, and we may not agree that women have it much tougher than men in the workplace. Different expectation level, role incredulity when women have certain jobs. I probably don't need to convince you that whether it's failure to promote, pregnancy discrimination, issues around women's health from menstruation through menopause, unequal pay. These are issues that women specifically deal with, and women of color, forget about it. Way worse. But right now, here's really what we're talking about, and I want to just focus on whether black or white women of a certain age who are going to receive a PIP. But here's what you need to know about it if you haven't received a PIP. Be aware, be hyper aware of whether anything is changing in your work milieu. Have you gotten a new manager? Is there a new CEO? Has there been a reorganization that is not directly threatening your job, where they're saying, we're going to eliminate your position? Because if that's true, and your position is actually eliminated, like legitimately, cleanly, it's a difficult thing, right, to push back against that. Although we still do, because sometimes women are selected for termination, even in these reductions in force cases, right, when they're actually eliminating 1,000 jobs, but they're eliminating 1,000 jobs using algorithms that don't care whether or not this person who's on that list was dealing with pregnancy, was out on maternity leave for 3 months, but it's not adding that to the algorithm when it's looking at productivity, when it's looking at it's not looking at whether you got a reasonable accommodation or you deserve one. It's not looking at any of the other metrics other than what they tell it to, in terms of either performance or, time and attendance, absenteeism, etc. Whatever they're looking at in those metrics, they tend to penalize women, particularly women either at the stages of pregnancy, prepartum, postpartum, or certainly when you get to perimenopause and menopause. Because if women who are of any age, you can have early onset perimenopause because of surgical intervention, but typically in that 40 to 64 year age cohort, if women are experiencing, and we're all becoming much more aware these days, thank goddess, finally, right? There's a trend. This is culturally, we're talking about what used to be an icky pookie, as my daughter used to say, taboo, shame-based topic of women's health, women's natural biological processes, right? And when you get to, we were banging our heads against the wall, all of us stakeholders in the women's health, women's rights space for decades, to get where we are now with the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act of 2023, the landmark women's rights, civil rights legislation that went into law on June 27, 2023, during a time when Democrats had the Senate and the House and the White House, right? And so we were able to get that passed. I don't know that everyone appreciates, and certainly employers are way behind keeping up with current events on this, that pregnancy is itself now a protected status, as well it should be. If it were men who got pregnant, if men could get pregnant, as I've said to juries for years, the Family and Medical Leave Act, the paternity leave, would be 12 months long and fully paid. And when I say that to juries when I'm selecting them, people laugh. Why do they laugh? Besides that I tend to say it in humorous ways, because it's true. We all know that it's true. Now when we get to the bookend stages of a woman's reproductive life cycle, perimenopause and menopause, we have no specific federal law yet, although we're working on it with Congress, the Menopause Workers Fairness Act, modeled after the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. Rhode Island just became the first state to prohibit discrimination based on perimenopause and menopause symptoms, which are, by the way, even now, important point, the symptoms of perimenopause and menopause, when they're severe enough, and they often are, when they are affecting a so-called major life activity like sleeping, thinking, working, right? You are entitled to flexibility from your employer, an interactive process, a reasonable accommodation analysis, because those symptoms, and also if they affect major bodily functions, which of course it does, we're talking about perimenopause and menopause, your endocrine system is a bodily function that is typically going a little bit wild during these stages. That is the definition, or these are the definitions of disability, even though menopause itself, just like pregnancy, isn't a disability, but the resulting symptoms of it are entitled to protection. Not to mention that it's typically happening to women over 40, right? And 40, we are protected by the federal age statutes, age discrimination statutes in the country. And it's a sex-based claim. It's obviously only happening to women. So you've got this holy trinity. You've got this synergy. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. It's a so-called intersectionally protected claim because it's sex, disability, and age when you're over 40. So it's actually the sweet spot. It's powerful if, and this is the point, this is my point about getting out ahead of a PIP, and then I'm going to get to what you do if you're too late and you have this performance improvement plan. But if you can feel the winds, the prevailing winds starting to churn and blow, where you're being treated differently, singled out, like a case where I was representing a woman briefly, and I'm going to tell you why, because it was brief, because she was so, this was a couple of years ago, she was so mortified that she was written up and put on a performance improvement plan, 48 years old. Never a problem with any employer, never a problem with this employer. She had a new younger male manager who wrote her up, put her on a PIP for her current inability to manage tasks. And what he was referring to is, yeah, she did have a diminution in her abilities somewhat because she had outrageous insomnia. She had so many symptoms for so long that her GP, her primary care provider, was telling her, was in her head, was prescribing psychotropic meds. When she finally consulted a menopause aware and trained practitioner, and they don't have to be OBGYNs, naturopaths, nurse practitioners, osteopaths, a provider that understands menopause and perimenopause and can affirmatively state that his patient is in perimenopause and dealing with these symptoms, for example, of insomnia. And now he or she they are requesting a reasonable accommodation and flexibility, whatever that may be, for you. Some it was rest breaks and some potential menopause absences, change in schedule, clothing, attire, air conditioning, fans, whatever it may be. Not only are you entitled to it, absent an undue hardship on your employer, but the employer would have to, but the request alone, the request itself in writing, is considered civil rights protected activity. So before you're on a PIP, if you are already experiencing differential treatment based on sex, so this doesn't have to be smoking gun stuff. You don't need to have recorded your manager using, misogynistic language or saying something really stupid and offensive. It can simply be that you believe as a woman or as a woman of color or as a woman of a certain age that you are experiencing differential treatment, disparate treatment, hostility, you're being singled out, you're not getting the opportunities others are getting. And again, you can sense that they're starting to want to manage you out the door. That would be the time, right, before you're written up or put on a performance improvement plan, that you are stating what you need and what you believe this discriminatory treatment is. You're standing up for yourself. You're speaking truth to power. You are asking for what you need, and those requests under the law are considered protected activity. Meaning, if you ask for accommodations for menopause, for example, and you do not receive them, and then it goes south soon thereafter, you're terminated, for example, the timing of the termination on the heels of your protected request or complaint gives you legal leverage, legal and factual leverage, either to prevent them from doing so or to realize that they have exposure and they best be offering you severance if they do wish to let you go. It's a way of empowering yourself to make sure you're not skulking away on your hands and knees after they fire you. And worse, if you quit, which a lot of times women do, they just get so fed up, I understand it, but when you quit, it's an unforced error. You're throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because when you quit, forget about having an actual claim that, absent outrageous circumstances that a lawyer is going to take forward to court. But you divest yourself of the ability to collect unemployment benefits. Don't quit. Okay, so this is an important point. And again, all of this comes down to, and the reason I'm mentioning, aside from the fact that I'm a women's rights in the workplace lawyer, talking about women and women of a certain age or stage, is that if you're 26 years old, whatever gender you are, and you lose your job, you kind of can bounce back a lot faster. If you're 49 and you are managed out the door, and it was partly because of sexism and ageism and the intersectionality of both, women of a certain age are considered older, are they not, in our culture, than comparably aged men? I mean, just look at Hollywood. How many times have you seen the late Sean Connery or Clint Eastwood or Harrison Ford or whomever, Robert Redford, paired with romantic leads that are 20 or 30 years their junior? And we accept that. We wouldn't really accept that if the sexes were reversed. Clearly, women have it tougher than men. So I'm mentioning, and when you're 40, 50, or 60 and you lose your job, good luck, especially because you're probably at the height of your career, you're earning the most you've ever earned, presumably, which makes you a tempting target for employers to fire you, because then they can get a lot less expensive help with a lot younger folk. So the upshot here of this is, if you can, you want to get out ahead of the pip. It's like, it's much better to not fall ill and take care of yourself than find out you're sick and have to deal with the cure, right? This is much better to get out ahead of it, because then the PIP itself will be considered, or we would argue, that it's retaliatory. And if it's too late and they already put you on a performance improvement plan, here's the thing. You're not alone. Don't fret. I mean, you're entitled to feel upset and disappointed and afraid. But instead of just lying down and letting it demoralize you and just go, okay, I guess I'm just doomed, you ask yourself, and you ask the employer, and you put all of this in writing, right? Who's doing the evaluation? What is it based on, these poor metrics? You may have had an unblemished history for years. What has changed? Are you being singled out in some way because you're a woman, because you're an older woman, because you have some symptoms related to these transitional periods, because of pregnancy, because you had just requested a raise or a promotion, because you have, over time, and you may not have even really registered it fully, you have been dealing with unwelcome sexualizing or objectifying energy from men. It's not an unusual affair. And so it's always important to note that you're an at-will employee, presumably. So few of us can command contracts. People think they have contracts, but they're really just offer letters and employment agreements. At-will employment means that you can be fired at any time for any reason, or for absolutely no reason at all. And of course, you could quit anytime you want. But, this is not only and when we talk about sexism, we're the only country in the world, certainly in the Western world, but essentially everywhere. I think there's like 2 nations left. In fact, I used to say Suriname, but now they have maternity leave policies. I think there's like 2 Pacific Island tiny nations that join us in the full and complete lack of federal support for, parental rights, caregiver issues, and postpartum for recovery from childbirth and bonding with your baby, unless you're in one of the 12 or so states that have paid family leave laws. So we're pretty backward when it comes to women's issues, women's rights, women's health. And while we're coming, New York is considering a menopause law now that has some traction. I hope that in 2026 we'll be able to say that we have that. And lots of things, even given the cultural moment that we're in, that is entirely sexist and racist, the elimination of DEI, everything that's going on with this administration, while it shall pass, even with all of that, the laws have never been better. They've never been better. Federal law for sex discrimination, even though it doesn't specifically include menopause yet, the laws have never been better in terms of discrimination, in terms of retaliation. So we need to flex a little. We need to stand up and notify our employers when we feel this way, because it's protected to do that. It gives you juice that you didn't know you have in terms of leverage. And again, why would you go quietly to your rest, to borrow a line from Ragtime? You put too much into your work, your life. This is your economic lifeline. And if you're fired at 52, and you're making $175,000 a year just as one placeholder, it's going to be challenging right now to replace that income, or it may be. So we want to make sure that you're in a position to hold your employer's feet to the fire and hold them to account, so that the worst case scenario, if you are terminated, or if they realize that you've checked them, like in chess, and like they don't want to fire you because it would be so clearly smell and look retaliatory, then you're negotiating a separation agreement. Whether you're terminated or not, the severance is negotiable, particularly if you have a complaint on file before or even after you're put on a PIP, but it's much better to do so before, because then the PIP itself can be characterized as utterly retaliatory. See where I'm going with this? So, very important that if you receive a performance improvement plan, that you don't just take it lying down, you get proactive. But more important is to try to be aware in your work of whether or not something like a PIP may be coming, because you would want to get the jump on your employer with a protected complaint, because that's what creates the tension. That this is what makes the world go round in terms of resolutions and settlements of these claims. You don't want to wait till you're terminated, when the horse is out of the barn, so to speak, and you're $1 short and a day late, and suddenly you're complaining. It makes it much more difficult at that point.